Harriet Tubman, a hero to slaves all around America. The controversy depicting Harriet Tubman as a primary force in the Underground Railroad has developed in recent years. From an obscure, unknown hero to an icon representing freedom, Harriet Tubman is a symbol for many of resilience and persistence. While many accepted the conflict between whites and African Americans in the South, Harriet was willing to compromise her own safety and freedom to help others escape the bondage of the South. In the mid-1800s, the United States was split up between the North and the South. The North believed that slavery is wrong and was strongly against having slaves there. The South, however, believed that nothing was wrong with having slaves. Slaves in the South wanted to have the chance to escape to the North where they could be free. Harriet was born into slavery in Maryland on a plantation in 1822.
Just like any other enslaved person, she was, from the time that she could probably walk, she was probably having to do different chores and things like that. And as an enslaved woman, there was also that fear of being raped or being taken advantage of by the overseer or by the slave master. That was a common practice. And also just every day of the threat of being beaten for simple things. She might have, if you looked at the overseer the wrong way, then you might have been whipped.
Harriet's birth name was Armida Ross. Since she was born into slavery, she was raised in undesirable surroundings. She grew up being whipped and beaten. Her sleeping conditions were loathsome due to the fact that it was below freezing and she wasn't provided much warmth. In 1844, Harriet married a man named John Tubman. This is when she changed her name to Harriet Tubman after her mother. John Tubman was a free black man. They had been married for 5 years when Harriet received a note from a free man that there was a possibility of her being sold to another family. Back then, slavery was at its peak and people were always buying and selling slaves. Harriet had started a family and didn't want to be taken away from them for good. This caused Harriet to decide to leave her family and run away to Philadelphia. If she were to run away, she could always come back to get them. In the mid-1800s, they didn't have cars, and slaves had very little access to horses, so her journey was on foot. It was a long journey for her, but she eventually arrived in Philadelphia. When she arrived in Philadelphia, she had no one to greet her. I had crossed the line. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, she explained. She was able to get a job in Philadelphia and made some money for about a year. In 1850, she decided to return to Maryland so that she could bring her sister and 2 nieces back to the North and so that she could help them get to safety. They made the journey to Philadelphia just as they were safe. Harriet returned again and saved her brother and a couple other men. She made many more trips, one of them being for her husband. When she had returned this time, she found out that her husband had left her and married someone else. This sparked the idea to begin the Underground Railroad.
So you would hide during the day. You might travel it during the day, but your best bet was to travel at night. So you have the cover of darkness, and you had to find ways to keep, the dogs, the hound dogs, off your scent. So they would, a lot of times they would walk through shallow water. They would just have different ways of really traveling back and forth. But she was able to evade all those times that she traveled. She was able to evade the slave catchers and the dogs and stuff.
Harriet was quickly called the Moses of her people. She got this nickname by leading the enslaved blacks to freedom, and that's exactly what Moses had done with the enslaved Jews in Egypt. This nickname soon spread to the slave catchers. They were under the impression that Harriet was a man due to this title. They even made wanted signs for Moses. That caused a great controversy when they found out that this man was indeed a woman. Harriet was very determined to save as many slaves as she could. She made around 19 trips back and forth between Maryland and the North. Each trip, she would guide approximately 16 people to freedom. Overall, she rescued over 300 slaves without failure. She carried a pistol on her, and she would use it to keep the group safe. If a slave wanted to leave, that could have risked the safety of the group, so she would use her pistol to encourage them. She never left anyone behind. She said, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." The leaders on the Underground Railroad were called conductors. Harriet was the most influential conductor. Along with conductors, there were also stations. The stations would be either a home, a church, or someone's barn. That is where the slaves would stay. A lot of the time, they would stay hidden underneath the floorboards or in an attic. In order for the slaves, also known as the cargo or passengers, to know that station was safe, they would look for a quilt design that would either be hanging on their porch or on their door. One of the quilt designs was the bear's paw. Some people believed that this meant that they should follow the tracks of a bear, while others believed that it means that, like a bear, they should try to find the quickest path leading to their destination. There was also the monkey's wrench, and that meant that the passengers should begin to gather their stuff for their journey. When they would see that quilt design, they knew that they were about to go inside. Another design was the flying geese. This design represented the fleeing slaves and made the slaves aware that it was a station.
They used, there are different ways to kind of travel through the Underground Railroad. So there are different symbols, messages that they used in order to know, the route that they would need to go. You did have different quilt squares that had different symbols that kind of spelled out a story, and it was code for where to go next. So they did use quilts to tell, kind of as a map for the Underground Railroad. But then you also had the different stations. Stations might have been a barn, it might have been a church, it might have been someone's house actually. So you had abolitionists that would actually open their homes to freedom seekers. And so in order for slaves, because you had to be really, really secretive, and there's a lot of codes and a lot of hidden messages. And so if you came upon a house and you need to know whether or not, this was a safe place to stay, then one of the ways that you could tell was to look for a lantern. If the lantern was lit in the windowsill, that meant that it was a safe place.
From a young age, she had setbacks, but she was always able to persevere through it all. When she was 7 years old, she was hit in the head with a 2-pound iron weight. From that day on, she suffered from a disease called epilepsy and occasional seizures. She inspired other slaves to find the courage to stand up to slavery. It was Harriet that sparked the flame to abolish slavery. If she had never escaped slavery herself, the Underground Railroad would not have been as successful as it was. Slavery could have taken longer to abolish if it wasn't for the courage and persistence of Harriet Tubman.